Howdy folks, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am your host, the Mighty Bjorn, and today for you got a bit of a Dungeons & Dragons video, but really quick before I dive into today's video, I do have a Patreon page. It's a great way to provide additional support for my channel. Link will be down below in the video description, but another way is also liking, commenting, and subscribing to the channel, sharing the video, things of that nature. It all helps me out as a growing YouTube channel. Now, let's get into today's video. In today's video, I'm going to be talking mostly about Dungeons & Dragons and the Longsword. Okay, forgive me. Actually, the Arming Sword. Because Dungeons & Dragons, since I can recall, has actually gotten the depiction of the Longsword incorrect. I'm not sure if it has to do with the research of the time when Dungeons & Dragons was created. Understand that the longsword within Dungeons & Dragons has been misrepresented going as far back as Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, essentially since I can remember. And my guess is it was probably misrepresented within Dungeons & Dragons even before that. Essentially, when you read the description within Dungeons & Dragons of what a longsword is, I'm not so sure with more modern Dungeons & Dragons, but I know with Advanced and 3.5 is essentially you have a long single-handed sword with a blade roughly 28 to 30 inches with a handle constructed for single-handed use roughly 5.5 to 6 inches long. So pretty much what you see here. And actually that description actually accurately describes the arming sword, also known as the knightly sword or the knight sword or the knight's arming sword. So there's actually a couple different names that it goes under. And essentially, a lot of historians draw conclusions and evolutions to swords such as the spatha, which essentially was a slightly redesigned, longer gladius, mostly used by Roman cavalry and officers. And then, of course, the quote-unquote Viking sword. Yeah, I really don't like the name Viking sword very much. It's not a really good, accurate description of the sword. But one thing that has to be understood, too, as I'm sitting here talking about these swords, is they were swords. There wasn't a lot of different names for different types of swords. They were all swords, realistically. And essentially, names for swords over the years has become more of a descriptor of a kind of what kind of sword it is, and usually what area it comes from. Now, there is actually some good depictions of a longsword within both film and video games. Kingdom Come Deliverance actually has real legit longswords that are used one-handed or two-handed, as well as Aragorn from The Lord of the Rings actually uses a longsword. Although sometimes I think it's a bastard sword. I'm really foggy about his sword because it does seem more bastard sword like than longsword, but there's features there that stands out as longsword. Let me get into it. A longsword is actually a blade ranging from 31 to 36 inches, although I believe it can go as high up as 38. It has a very similar blade construction, though, to the arming sword, just that it's longer. Now, when it comes to the handle itself, it's actually still only a 5 to 6 inch long handle, but longswords tend to have an extended tang. That's to add more weight and to help balance the weight of the sword. That tang can also works as kind of a handle in itself, allowing the user to use the sword both one-handed and two-handed. However, going from some information I have seen doing research on the longsword, is there was actually some issues related to the longsword, which made the longsword actually quickly fall out of favor. They would start appearing around the 13th century, 13th, 13th century, I believe it was, if I remember correctly. And they would actually quickly fall out of favor for the bastard sword. And the reason they fell out of favor for the bastard sword is because, well, the bastard sword has a very similar blade length, but the blade itself was made a little heavier. That was to give the sword more heft. Now, with that being said, the handle was also reconstructed to be a little bit more user-friendly for two hands, although it is still considered, you could still wield it one-handed. I've actually wielded bastard swords one-handed. They're a little unwieldy when doing that. I personally, if I was to fight with a bastard sword in a real, life or death situation, I would not use the bastard sword one-handed. I would use it with two hands, and honestly, I would actually opt out of the bastard sword if I have my choice and go to a great sword, which brings me to the next part. So the bastard sword kind of replaced the longsword, and the longsword would kind of just fade over time. Now, around the same time of the bastard sword, you would actually start getting the two-handed sword, or the Zweihander. There's a lot of different names for this sword. Claymore is another one that gets thrown around a lot, which Claymore is actually incorrect, but we've kind of accepted in modern day society and knowledge of what a claymore is, and it's actually incorrect, but that's neither here nor there. But essentially, what you have with your great swords or your two-handed swords is you have a much longer blade, usually ranging roughly to anywhere between 5 and 6 foot long, some of them even longer. And you actually have a much longer handle. Actually, you have a longer handle than you really need. As you can see here with this picture, the hands, there's really enough space there to put a third hand on the hand guard there, or on the handle. But these swords would actually kind of more or less take, by the time these would become extremely popular on the battlefield, the longsword would just kind of fade away completely. The bastard sword would continue for a while, but even the bastard sword would slowly fall out of favor for two-handed swords. And there's an obvious reason why all these different types of swords I'm talking about kind of fall out of favor. Even the arming sword sort of fell out of favor as a battlefield weapon in the process, and what it has to do with is armor. Swords were not very effective weapons against armor, especially when you start getting into plate armor. Even chain armor was pretty effective of protecting the wearer from slashing type attacks from like a sword. Now, with that being said, though, the arming sword sort of did remain in favor compared to all these other swords that would just kind of come and go. The arming sword would kind of hang out and still remain in favor as basically a badge of office, the symbol of the knight, lords, etc. And they would kind of just be more or less turned into the sidearm, the pistol of the time, if you will. The wealthy would have arming swords and so on and so forth. Knights would use arming swords. Kings would have arming swords. Essentially, it would become a backup battlefield weapon alongside something else. So maybe the user would have something along the lines of a polearm, and then they would also have an arming sword as a backup weapon, or they would have a great axe or a pole axe, and then they would have an arming sword as a backup weapon, even a bow, and then you'd have an arming sword as a backup weapon. Now, throughout that time too, knights tend to also keep, mounted knights also tend to keep arming swords with them as well for riding, because they would use their lance and then they would start using the arming sword if they couldn't get to another lance. So what does this mean for Dungeons and Dragons? Well, how would I want to put this? It really doesn't mean a whole heck of a lot. It's just kind of throwing some knowledge out there. Now, if you really wanted to do something about it, you could change the arming sword to the, or you change the long sword to the arming sword, essentially is what you would do. if you want to write all this down in the books or something like that. And then you would add a new spot for the longsword. And personally, what I would do is I would do a rule very similar to the bastard sword, where with the bastard sword, it does, if I remember correctly off the top of my head, it does 1d10 damage when wielded one handed, but when wielded two handed, it does 1d12 damage. And essentially, that's what I would do with the longsword. That's just me personally. If you really want to do something about it, honestly, it doesn't really mean a whole heck of a lot. And honestly, I really wouldn't make the changes because the longsword has always been kind of acknowledged to what it is. This is just me taking some time and dumping some knowledge on you about kind of the historic truth and what the longsword really is. And essentially, that all these years that Dungeons and Dragons has depicted the longsword as the arming sword, and they're more or less completely incorrect about what the longsword is, because it's realistically just a lighter version of a bastard sword. But anyway, folks, I am going to wrap today's video up at that. Hopefully you all enjoyed it. Thank you very much for tuning in, and have yourself a wonderful day.